Hello, everyone. I'm so excited that you decided to spend this day with us. Well, 1.5 hours. We'll just give it 1 minute for people to start joining in, and then we'll kick off our final webinar of the Agri-Health series. So just grab a tea or a bit of water before we get going to the finance part of the Agri-Health. Okay. I'm gonna get going. So again, thank you so much for joining today. My name is Susanna and I am co-founder of HarvesCare, and I'll be your host today together with Anne, which is also a co-founder of the HarvesCare. Well, we are finishing off with 5 months of learning journey. So it was quite many webinars that we already have in our backpack of knowledge around agri-health. And before we'll kick off with Dr. Amy and Hans, and we'll dive into what does agri-health means in investment world, and which kind of models and tools we have in order to start funding agri-health. We're going to just look back for a few moments. So for those who have already joined us on the previous webinars, you already know it very well, but just as a short intro, this webinar series was done thanks to the support of European Union and Province of Holland under Agri-Health Outcome Payment Model project, which we ran together with 5 other organizations in the Netherlands. Our home will focus on connecting agriculture, healthcare, and impact financing. We are using food is medicine principles and models to start working on creating new markets for organic and regenerative farmers and build future where healthy food is part of the healthcare and accessible to everyone. A few words on our work in the Netherlands. So we run produce prescription or food pharmacy programs for low-income diabetes type 2 patients. That means that we source local, organic, regenerative food from local farmers. We provide this food boxes to our patients, which often have structure barriers to access such a food. And we combine it with other behavior change tools like coaching with registered dietitians, cooking workshops, social events, and access to an app which we built with, which have all the recipes and small nudges on changing the behavior. And we ran a first randomized control trial in 2025. And in 2 weeks, we are done with our second randomized control trial, where we have more than 60 participants actually, where we collect various data from cardiometabolic outcomes, BMI, etc. Of course, the HbA1c, together with more quality of life and their dietary intake. And what Anna is very busy with is to working on creating an impact bond, which could start accounting for the reduction or the minimalization of the prevalence of diabetes type 2, or other tools like blended finance or just direct collaboration with health insurers. So if you would be interested in finding more about our work, you can scan the QR code or just Google HarvesCare to learn more. And yeah, as I said, this is a final webinar of 5 series or 5 sessions we had. So I'll take 2 minutes to reflect back of what we have been learning together so far already. And we started with Ronnie Trinberg from Tufts University Food is Medicine Institute, where she presented us the progress and the work that has been done in the space of food is medicine in past, especially 10 years, and how much this movement is catching up in US, but also Canada, Australia, and hopefully in Europe. And what really stayed with me is when she said that when she submitted her PhD thesis on food is medicine over 10 years ago, she could just use few papers from the space, and now there are over 270, but I think by now, when we are having this webinar, it's reaching towards almost 300 papers published in the space. Then we had our session with Dr. Jenny Goodman, which is an ecological medicine doctor and author. She took us on a deep dive on how all the systems are interconnected and how pollution in soil, in water, in our local environments directly affect our body systems, but also the environmental systems around us. And what's something that really stayed with me is when Dr. Jenny said that we can't poison the planet by poisoning the people. what's in the earth, it's in our bodies. So if you're interested in listening or rewatching any of those webinars, I put a QR code here where you can find all of those recordings from before sessions. And Dr. Jenny has also 2 wonderful books, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the topic of ecological medicine. Then we have a session with famous Dan Kittredge. Dan walked us through his research on nutrient density and more than a decade of work and dedication to try to see really what affects the quality of produce we consume and how it correlates to soil health at the end of the day. And this is also was his biggest premise, that the only thing that connects is the level of life in the soil. In terms of nutrient density, of course. So Dan has lots of available materials online. If any of you is interested into his report, just check out Bionutrient Food Association, where you can access directly all the reports and research that had been published on several crops in the last 5 years or so. And our final webinar, which happened just a month ago, was with Erin Martin and Michelle Johansson Howell. Both of those amazing women are running produce prescription programs in US. Erin is famous for her advocacy on using regenerative sourcing into the produce prescription programs. Michelle has her own farm, which also acts as a food hub where they aggregate regenerative local produce in the region and then distribute it to different foodist medicine programs. I had the greatest honor and pleasure meet them in Washington, D.C. on FIMCon 2 weeks ago, and they are even more inspiring in real life than they already are online. But again, so much work is being happening in US in this space. And what Erin, I think I remember, said, farmers are the new healthcare infrastructure. So for the last 5 months, we have almost 1,115 signups, 14 signups. For the 5 webinars. Together, we have 21,400 minutes attended. If you ask why such a strange number, because Zoom gives the numbers of attendees in minutes. So this is how much we have spent time together on learning about the Agri-Health. And together we had 7.5 hours with together session on going through all of the structures that, in my mind, I would be introduced to this space, 5 years ago. I would need to think in all of those categories to make possible what we're working on now, which is actually implement an agri-health structure in real life. And that's why we're finishing with finance. You cannot do any of this without first thinking of how can we make it happen. So that's why I'm so excited to be having those 2 amazing experts today in this space. And in the second, we'll hear 2 different perspectives, but very complementary, from a bit of a private sector on a pioneer edge, cutting edge of agri-health, and a bit of more private public pioneering models of how to make those 2 systems work. But before I give it off to our 2 amazing speakers for today, I just want to briefly tell you that if you would like to continue this learning and you would like to transition the learning from online space to physical space, that I would love to invite all of you to our European Foodist Medicine and Agri-Health Summit, which will happen in November, 19 to 20 of November in Amsterdam. We have 2 days of amazing speakers covering from, deep dive on foodist medicine. I'm super happy because we managed to get people flying in from Australia, from Canada, from US to being really physically with us in the space, presenting on the newest scientific evidence and progress in the space. But also we will have a competition for new foodist medicine projects where we are going to grant 10,000 euros to start a new foodist medicine model somewhere in a European country. So if you know somebody that you think could benefit from this invitation, please do send them a link. And I think Anna also shared this link in our chat. So before we go to the speakers, I would also love to invite you to our Mentimeter. We always start and finish the sessions with just understanding a bit where is everybody in this space right now? What is your understanding, but also what is your perception on this particular model or this particular topic? So we will have either a link in a chat or I'm also just going to share my screen here where you can scan the code, and I just have a few questions to you around the finance and agri-health. So I'll give it to you 1 minute just to log in, and as we'll start, you will still see the QR code on the screen, so you can still join in any moment. I'll wait for the 10th person to join, and then we'll have a round number and we'll get going. Okay. Here we go. So I'm sorry if this is not too big, but I'm just going to read it to you as well. So question, should food that provide balanced nutrition be subsidized for patients the way some medicine are? So it should remain fully an individual responsibility. Should it be subsidized for specific high-risk patient groups, subsidized broadly for patients with chronic disease, or subsidized for everyone as a public health measure? So far, most of us think that foods should be, in general, subsidized as a public health measure, with some thinking that there should be some limitations of accessing such a subsidy. All right. Well, happy to see these results. Next question, who do you think should finance access to healthy nutrition for chronically ill patients? So assuming that most of us do believe that this should be financed, who should it be? Should it be health insurers? Should it be government, municipality, or maybe still individual paying for it, or maybe you are just not sure? And of course, I know that as we are in the world, our healthcare systems work very differently. In Scandinavia, there is not really a separate healthcare insurance as we do have it in the Netherlands, or in US. That's also a different story. But if somebody would pay, who should it be? Okay, so I can see that most of us believe that it should be governmental funding coming for such a project with some healthcare insurer support, I guess, if it's relevant for the local healthcare system, and some of us are not sure yet. So hopefully by end of today's webinar, we'll be all sure who should pay for it. Okay, if healthy foods were subsidized, how much do you believe local and organic sourcing should be prioritized? So should we focus on cost as the main priority? Sustainability should be a minor consideration, a significant factor, or should be prioritized whenever it's feasible? And the reason why I'm saying whenever it's feasible is because, of course, different geographical locations, not everything that is nutritious we are able to source from local farms. So it's something that we had to often make decisions with our own programs to prioritize sourcing organic, or do we prioritize sourcing local and in season. But I'm happy that nobody said that we should focus on costs. Maybe that also tells something about the audience of our webinars that are joining. So most of you believe that it should have a priority, or at least a significant factor. Alrighty. So now very specific questions. How familiar are you with an impact bond or outcome-based payment, as that's going to be a major part of our webinars today? So I never heard of it. I heard about it. I know quite a lot. Or are you very familiar with it, or maybe even if you're already working with the model? Okay, we have some experts in the space, and most of the people have heard about it, but maybe don't know yet exactly how they work. So I'm very happy that we have a Hans in the house today helping us to clarify. Alrighty. And so do you think that an impact bond is a feasible solution to work on food is medicine model? So when I mean food is medicine model, I mean providing patients with either produce that were already prepared in a meal, or raw produce that can be cooked and delivered to patients in order for them to reverse or at least minimize their condition. And just as a spoiler alert, I don't think there was yet an impact bond created on food is medicine, but we hope that that will change over time. So most of you either say yes, or you're not sure yet, or you maybe don't feel fully knowledgeable about this topic to decide. So again, I'm very happy that we do have this webinar today to work this out. And yeah, just a few words, if you could just share with us what are your hopes from today's webinar. It's always very helpful and interesting for us to understand why people are joining us on those sessions. Don't be shy, anything is good. Okay, so we have more knowledge on current financing tools and challenges, broadening my understanding understanding how impact investors can support food as medicine initiatives, how contracts are creating insight on financial models for sustainable solutions, exploring how my master research can be further developed and implemented as it relates to food as medicine finance very much. Practical insights about financial structuring for these assets and projects from investor and funder perspective. More information and understanding of the financial models. Is it about the shared costs and benefits? What are the risks? Very well structured, I think, objectives, and hopefully we can share some answers to those questions today. And final one, how to bridge the different time horizons for governments and the long-term benefits of food as medicine insurance, PLL. And one more insights in the barriers of the food as medicine and the opportunities. I think if some of you are interested specifically on food as medicine, please go and watch also the webinar with Ronit, as she answered a lot of, she really laid the foundation for food as medicine. So that would be a really perfect place to start. All right, so that's it for now. Thank you so much. And Amy, I would just stop sharing, and I would like to bring you in with your amazing story, going from a medical doctor to understanding the connection with the food system crisis and now working in the investment fund.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Let me just... Can you hear me fine?
Yes, perfect.
I'll just check that. Can you see it as a full screen? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. Susanna was one of the first people I met as I transitioned from medicine into the wonderful world of agri-health. So I'm always very happy to share a screen or a room with her. As she said, I'm Amy, and I'm a medical doctor by training, and I will leave the finance questions largely to Hans because I've actually only worked in the world of venture capital for the past couple of years. So I'll just give you a bit of background. I spent over a decade in the NHS, most of it in anaesthetics and intensive care medicine. And I want to start where I actually worked, which was at the bedside. And I think, maybe Jenny alluded to this, but I think often the clinical conversation sits in a different room to the ag conversation. And that's one of the key things that I think needs to change. 3 figures are really going to frame my whole talk. 3/4 of deaths worldwide are now non-communicable. So heart disease, cancer, diabetes. And the Global Burden of Disease study attributes 11 million deaths a year to diet alone. By that same accounting, poor diet now sits ahead of tobacco as a driver of mortality. And what I want to do is talk a bit about the mechanism from all the way from soil to bedside, and then talk about the question which this whole event turns on. If the biggest lever of health sits upstream of the hospital, then why are we not pulling on it, and who pays for it? So there were many nights on my intensive care unit where I would look down the row of beds and know that almost everyone there had arrived due to lifestyle and the inevitable complications associated with it. It was obviously completely tragic, and probably the worst epiphany that I had from a career point of view, because I couldn't really unsee what I was seeing, which was really the end point of decades of exposure that had sort of drifted subclinically for years before anybody really did anything about it. And that's the thing that no one really talks about from a hospital medicine point of view in this setting. There's a huge amount of skill, the equipment's extraordinary, but we really deploy all of it against damage that was decided decades upstream. And what I noticed after a while was that I was really trained and resourced to treat the presentation, the organ failure, the crisis, but I was absolutely never trained to treat the years before that had produced it. It's really no exaggeration to say that I learned almost nothing about nutrition at medical school. And so I went on a journey of discovery into the food system and was pretty horrified by what I learned, but sort of pledged that I would try and do something about it. So I think one of the things is we're dealing with really big systems and big beasts that require have lots of moving parts. And I want to be precise about where the lever is in terms of what we know and what we don't, because that whole distinction was a lot of my medical training, but is also a lot to do with my current role. I think at the top, the evidence is really strong and guideline grade. Dietary patterns drive chronic disease. I don't think anybody is contesting that, and it certainly sits in the same evidence tier as what we act on in a clinic every day. But one layer down, I think there is still emerging evidence, that causal chain from soil biology to nutrient density to a human outcome. I don't think anybody will refute that food grown in healthier soil is better for you, but it's hard to establish the causal chain and it's hard to establish the outcomes. They're not really yet proven at scale. But I think that agriculture, by definition, sits at the foundation of the entire food system. And so this whole concept of the diet starting in the field is something that I think we really need to bring into common parlance. I will just point out one thing. I have a real issue, I'm sure lots of people listening do, with the constant diminishment of nutrition research. We have actually lots of excellent epidemiological data that shows the role of food in health and disease. And we also have pretty good data that show the overall health benefits of food grown in healthy soil. And I'm happy to talk about it more, but I do think a lot of the argument I always hear about food as medicine or about the role of agriculture is that the data isn't there. And I think that's a bit of a cop-out, frankly, but happy to talk about more. So we're here to follow the money because this is where it becomes an investment problem or a risk and not just a clinical one. And I'm sure lots of you saw the FAO's 2023 analysis, and across more than 150 countries, the hidden cost of our agri-food system had a price tag attached. And that was around $10 trillion on an industry that generates $10 trillion. So a huge chunk of this is all human health outcomes. And I think there's a structural fault, which I'm sure many people here will identify, which is the bill never really lands on the actor who generated it. And the other problem, which I think came up in one of the Mentimeter points, is that the timelines don't work. I was dealing with a patient who started eating ultra-processed food 30 years ago. That's an impossible time frame to wrap your head around financially. But what we are seeing is that the state, the employer, the individual, they are all absorbing the cost. It can be with their health, it can be with lost productivity, it can be with a healthcare budget that I'm sure, as in lots of countries in Europe, the UK is absolutely crippled by. And Hans will talk about these more, but this externality concept, this cost imposed on others that never shows up in the price, is something that we have to change. And I think that one of the things that drew me to Agri-Health was how few people are talking clinically and linking the costs borne by the food system to the costs borne by the patient. So I should have maybe changed this, because actually lots of doctors work in venture firms, but they normally work in pharmaceuticals, life sciences, biotech, something like that. But I don't know of any working in an agriculture venture firm. And everybody I speak to says, gosh, that is so different to what you used to do. And I don't really see it that way. I've just sort of changed my N number. So I would treat one patient at a time. And I think if the largest lever on population health sits upstream, which I believe it does, then capital allocated there, I just think can move the needle more on health than one device, one molecule that sits downstream. That's a bet that we make at the first 30, but it's also a bet that I have made with my career. And my job there really is to try and bring some causal reasoning into the diligence. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we structure it later on, but I think that the discipline that we apply to not extrapolate beyond the data that we have is what I now try to apply to companies that I see and the thesis as we develop it. Susanna asked this, to put this in, and it was, what does Agri-Health mean to me? And I'll come on to what I hope the future of Agri-Health looks like. But to me, it's very simply that agriculture should be treated as a determinant of human health. Because in the UK, we're very, very, and I'm sure the world over, we're very disconnected from where our food comes from. And we're very disconnected from what it does to our bodies. And I think that the whole optics around agriculture need to change, because I believe that it's one of the most underpriced human health delivery systems in the world. Now, I am emphatically not saying that a tomato grown a particular way is going to cure heart disease. That is obvious. But there are public health shifts across whole populations that can occur if we start to ask the question, how are we growing our food? What is the nutrient density? What is the toxicity? And what are the risks that agriculture poses? So at the First 30, we map all of the companies that we look at across these three pillars, and we set an evidence tier for what we're looking at. So any of the companies that we invest in should solve for one or more of these three things. There should be an improved nutrient profile or an improvement in nutrient density, or there should be a reduction in the toxic load of food, which is just, I think, becoming absolutely shocking, really, when you look, from baby formula to forever chemicals. It's a pretty scary environment. And the third thing, which actually, if any of you seen last week, the FAO brought out a costing of antimicrobial resistance associated to agriculture. There are lots of big systemic risks to human health that agriculture poses. And so these are the three buckets that we look at. And then I sort of map the evidence. It's very rare that I look at a company where the mechanism is clear from soil to human. I don't think I've ever had that. But you can mix together lots of different types and sources of evidence that go from established to emerging to biologically plausible. And just because something is emerging doesn't mean that it's not real. And so I think what I try to do is bring the clinical human health lens to some of the agriculture companies that we look at, because they're not really even marketing themselves as human health companies. And so that's one of the things that I think will change. So the question we get asked within the firm all the time is, why is this a thesis that's going to work now? Ag tech was a total nightmare in 2021. No one made any money. There was lots of money poured into it, et cetera, et cetera. And how are any of our companies going to make money? And a few of the things that have happened, I think, is if we just all remember this concept of you can't price what you can't measure. Well, measurement has suddenly become incredibly cheap. There is a collapse of costs from genomics to sequencing to gathering of real-time data. It was only 20 years ago that the Human Genome Project was, a multi-billion-dollar piece of work that you can now do on 23andMe for a couple of £100. So I think the cost of acquiring data has completely collapsed. But then it's also what can be done with that data. And, AI is processing what was a few years ago computationally impossible to do. And then I come on to the wearables always. I'd love to know how many of you have an Oura ring, which I swear by, or a Whoop band or anything. And the demand side is asking for something that the supply side can't answer now. We can monitor our heart rate variability every millisecond of every day, but we have no idea what's in the food that literally becomes us 3 times a day. So I think we I'm sure we might get to the cost curve argument at some point, but there is a demand from the consumers for more information. And it would also be totally remiss of me as a doctor not to mention GLP-1s in this conversation, because for all the noise around them, they are a proof that the system will pay at scale for a metabolic outcome. And I think we're at a point where the chain from soil to human is actually economically possible to close. We're not actually waiting on a breakthrough. We're waiting on the decision to gather the data and link it. So all of that might have sounded slightly like a mini TFT pitch, because what we believe in is the data and the infrastructure to make the biological quality of food legible. But just to kind of give you some tangible examples from our portfolio. And I know Dan Kittredge was one of the previous speakers, and it was actually his original idea to scan food to gather nutrient density information that drove Eric Smith to start Audacious. And if you don't know Audacious, then they're a company really worth looking at for a couple of reasons. One, they've done something that, really nobody else has done, and they're quantifying nutrient density and creating that transparency that is so missing from the food system. But the other reason they're interesting, I think, is they really tell the story for humans. One of the things that I find missing a lot from the space is we have to get better at storytelling. We have to hook people into things that are personal. And when you start talking about soil biology, you kind of lose people sometimes. And that's been my experience. People are like, I don't understand why that matters. But if you start to say, well, actually, did any of your children have formula? Because now there are heavy metals, there's botulism, there's all sorts of chemicals in it. And we're actually creating companies that are able to measure that and therefore generate value for the people who are building food systems for health. I'm happy to go into the other companies if anybody wants to talk about them another time, but I won't do it right now. So this was another good question from Susanna. What is the future of agri-health? And, how do we shift it from being this constant burden to a market that people pay for? Well, we have to have incentives align, and the if in this slide is doing quite a lot of work. But my aspiration would be in the near term, so in the next few years, that measurement becomes a baseline and food quality can be priced, but also traced through the chain. Because one of the things we really haven't solved for is, if I grow a better quality potato, how do I know that that better quality potato is actually reaching the consumer? Because there are so many things that happen along the supply chain. That's not an area that we get involved in at TFT, but it is obviously something that we need to solve for. In the medium term, call it the next 5 years, I think that AI will really help us close the soil to cell loop, and the upstream data that we generate can actually turn into population scale preventative insight. Longer term, and this is a healthcare system and a government point, we have to start looking to preventive medicine. And if we're able to do that, we have to look upstream to the farm, and healthy soils should be growing food for preventive medicine. At the moment, I think 80% of our healthcare system's budget is spent on lifestyle related preventable disease. 2% of the budget is dedicated to prevention. And until that is completely flipped on its head, we're not going to be able to reward the people who are generating food that can really prevent disease. Now, one thing that I hear a lot, and that I am also a big believer in, is that this should not be a luxury wellness brand where only people who can afford to buy premium products stand to benefit from a health point of view. But I think that's where investing in the data becomes really valuable, because what you end up doing is sort of raising the floor on the food system. If all you're doing is bringing transparency, then you're sort of democratizing the whole process. It doesn't require a change in the cost of the food structure. My goal is actually quite a boring outcome. It's that biological quality is just embedded in the system. It's your AI agent will choose your food for you based on your needs, ignorant of all marketing, and just based on quality alone. And if we had this conversation 5 years ago, I'm sure you would have all thought I was mad, but I'm sure most people are using AI and integrating it into their life on a daily basis. I know I am, and I really am technologically pretty illiterate. So that's the future for me for agri-health. So that's where I land, and it's also where I hand over, because the lever exists, the science is maturing, and the measurement is arriving. But what's missing is not the biology, it's not the technology, it's the instrument. We can, I believe, increasingly attribute a health outcome to an upstream change, but we've got no clean way to pay for the party who produced that outcome, good or bad. And when the saving lands not even years, but decades later, it becomes somebody else's budget, and that's a financing problem. And venture capital, being candid about my little corner of the world, cannot supply that instrument. We can fund the measurement layer, we fund the science and the companies that make the food quality legible, but we can't create a mechanism that pays for a health outcome that's realized a decade downstream. Fortunately, there's someone here who can explain that perfectly, and talk about the health outcomes and the instruments that we have to pay for it. So I will just stop sharing. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was super interesting, and even though I know your story a bit, it's always, I think you clarified so well of the transition, and yeah, maybe we hand it to Hans, and then we come back to the a bit more conversation style again. So Hans, I invite you to take us along to the other side, which is, what do we do with those unmatching timeline of different systems?
Okay, so you can see my screen as well. Thanks for a great presentation, Amy, and for setting this up, Susanna and Anna. Pleasure to be here. So what I will do here, just to give a very brief introduction to myself and my work, and then I'll try to give you an example of how this could work, how this model of could work in practice based on the experiences in Aarhus, Denmark. So just first of all, so my name is Hans. I'm an economist by training, and I have been working with outcome-based financing and impact investment for the past 10 to 15 years. But in various areas, it's been a lot of these programs have been health related, also mental health, but also been working with impact bonds within the areas of homeless youth, domestic violence, drug addiction, and other areas. So my role here today is not that I'm a health specialist like Amy, but I know a few things about how to create a financing model that bridges the gap between the key players that we want to bring together here. So hopefully I can convey some of that information to you today. So first of all, I think that when we start to have a discussion on this, Amy has already mentioned this indirectly or quite directly, is that how come that you only invest so few resources in prevention? So when you look at the data in Denmark and Holland, in the US, everywhere, actually, you can see that you only spend around 3% of the health budget on prevention, even though about 75% of all diseases are preventable. So how come that we deal with this in this odd way? Because it is, we all know that prevention, it's important. It's widely recognized as important. We continue to build more and more evidence on the value of prevention, but yet we still quite reluctant to invest in prevention and programs. So this sad fact, one being that these decision makers, they're just stupid, or that they don't know anything about it. They have not listened to all the good, they've not read all the good reports, etc. Or there is a structural problem. And I'll argue that, well, some of these decision makers might be stupid, but there's also a structural problem. And I think that if you want to create a sustainable financing solution, you need to acknowledge that there are these problems, because the solution that you are proposing needs to address these challenges that are out there. So I'll just mention a few of them. There are plenty, but just to give you an idea of what we are dealing with and how we can solve for that. I'll go into that later. So the first problem, and maybe the biggest problem when we talk about prevention, is this time lag. So when you look at prevention, then the costs, they are immediate. You need to pay for something right now, but the benefits, they only materialize years later. And you're talking about chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, etc. And you want to create a healthy food program for children, then you need to be very, very patient, because the health effect will not turn up before years later. So that this timing issue is obviously a key issue, because would you pay for something here if you're not around to reap the benefit when the benefits they actually occur in time? So that's one thing. But to make things even worse, then there's a fragmentation problem as well. And then the key thing here is when you pay for something in a municipality, for instance, then you'll only be able to reap part of the benefits yourself. Or if you're an insurance company, there will also be a lot of other players who will benefit from this investment in prevention. It might be the municipalities, the families, the individuals themselves, of course, also employers. There will be a lot of different people who will benefit from these investment into prevention. But the thing is, the benefits are shared across many different players, then everyone will look to the other and say, well, this might be your problem and not my problem. And so maybe you should just pay instead of me. So this fragmentation creates a huge challenge in terms of coordination. And then lastly, and that's kind of related to the time problem, is that there's a major uncertainty about the value of prevention over time. And the thing is, it's not that you don't know that you can prevent diseases, but you don't know how much it will cost to actually cure the diseases or manage the diseases when they arrive in time. So there might be a breakthrough. There might be something that comes in from the side and changing the business case dramatically. And then there's uncertainty that even though that you have good evidence today that this prevention program is effective, then you would never know with certainty whether you will actually be able to reap the benefits or not. So time fragmentation and uncertainty just make prevention difficult for municipalities and decision makers and insurance companies, etc. All that was known in Aarhus, Denmark. But they faced. They could look at the numbers. They could see that a lot of the population in the municipality was suffering from chronic illness, and you could see that if you look at the curves and the expectations, the forecast, that this will not get better soon. It'll get much worse, especially due to the ongoing aging of the population. That say, well, aging is a key source of problems, of course. So they were facing these problems, and they were kind of a push effect, say, well, we need to do something about this. And then at the same time, they had a lot of different prevention programs within the municipality. They have different service offerings for people living with diseases in the municipality. And they had a lot of good evidence that say, well, we have a problem, but we also have some solutions available here. So is there a case here? Yeah, there might be, but we do not have any certainty regarding the impact of these intervention if we are to offer them to more vulnerable groups, for instance, or people who have not been offered these solutions before. And then we face a budget constraint, a severe budget constraint within the municipalities, so that even though we would like to introduce all these different programs, then there's a limit to how much we can actually finance here. So what to do about that? That's the key problem here. And I think that most municipalities around Denmark, at least, but also around Europe and the world, will face the same kind of problem. The growing burden of disease. They know that there's evidence mounting up that prevention is a good idea. They have budget constraints and they cannot manage the uncertainty. But then again, when we had the discussion, I was approached by the head of health for any municipality. They had this discussion inside the municipality to say, well, we need to make a strategic choice here. The first thing is we can just do nothing and hope that this problem goes away. But that's really not that attractive a solution, because we can look at the numbers, we can see that the burden is increasing. And if the burden keeps increasing and we do not have anything in place, then we can simply not carry the burden when we get there. So the other alternative would be to do something, because we can simply not accept the consequences of inaction. So what they made this decision that say, okay, we need to do something. So now it's just not a question of whether you should do something or do nothing. It's a question of how we do it. And this is when the different financing models come in. And I'll just give you an idea to the different models here. So the traditional model when you are to pay for health intervention is that if you're a problem owner, this being the municipality, they can go out and say, okay, what kind of solutions are available out there? There are these different offerings, and we can do something ourselves. There will also be other ones who can, service providers who can offer solution here. So let's go out, we'll search the market and just select the best possible solution that we believe the most in, and then we'll just pay for the solution. It'll be delivered, and then we'll see what happens. So this model has the clear advantage that you have full control of what is being delivered. The problem is that you do not have any certainty that the solution that is offered creates any impact whatsoever. So that means that you will do a lot of things and you have control, but you cannot control the results. And if you're facing budget constraints and you cannot manage uncertainty, that's not really that attractive model. So then the second model comes in and say, well, what we really care about here is whether people, for instance, if you can look at diabetes, whether they develop a diabetes-related complication. So what we want to do here is we want to offer a specific solution to the citizens, and then we will say to a service provider, well, if the people that we offer this solution to, they do not develop a serious diabetes-related complication, then we will pay you. And from a problem owner perspective, this model is kind of ideal, because say, well, we know what is important to us. It is we really care about diabetes-related complications. We're not really sure how to prevent these in the best way, but if you can just pay for the outcome, then it must be the service provider's problem. So a good solution for the problem owner, but a bad solution for the service provider, because it will take a number of years before you know if the people who are offered this solution actually develops a diabetes-related complication or not. So then the impact model comes in here as the special model. So it's kind of a pay by performance model. It's the same kind of model as model 2, but instead of the service provider carrying the risk, what you do is that you invite an investor to the table and say, well, if you have a municipality, a problem owner who will like to pay if the problem is solved, we have a service provider who can offer an interesting solution here that will deliver the result that will unlock a payment from the problem owner. So why don't you finance the intervention, and then you'll get the potential outcome payment from the municipality. So now it turns out that now we have three players here. A municipality who will pay for what they are looking for. They'll pay for an observed reduction in diabetes-related complications. We have a service provider who knows how to prevent that, and they can offer a good solution. And we have an investor who are living by whose trade is to manage risk in an effective way. So for them, whether they should invest in a prevention program or a stock or whatever, housing, it's kind of the same thing. It is about their key trade is managing risk. So now it makes sense. And this was the model that we introduced in Aarhus. It was an impact model where we have a national investor and we have a service provider and we had the municipality as the problem owner. So what does it take to create an impact bond? And there are 4 different elements here that needs to fit together. And there's one of them that is much more important than all the others. So I'll get to that. So the first thing, of course, if you are to create an impact bond within also, if you're looking at agriculture, health, domestic violence, whatever the problem is, of course you need a theory of change. You need to have a solid understanding of the effect chain. You need to have a person like Amy who can tell you, okay, this leads to that. So if we can go in and change this part of the system, then we'll likely observe this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you need data. It's good to have a theory of change, but you need to have some observable change. So if you go in there, say you offer people with access to healthy food, you need to have data that can say that so you can monitor and evaluate the impact of the solution that they offered. That might be a change in BMI. That might be a change in physical activity. That might be a change in HbA1c or something else. But you need data that proves that you have created a change. And then thirdly, and that's where things try to usually get a bit tricky, you need an economic engine. So you might observe a change in BMI, but you need to say, well, what is that impact of changing a BMI? And if you look at, say, reducing a BMI from 25 to 24, the impact is minimal. But if you look at changing the BMI from 35 to 45, the impact is significant. So you need to understand that you need to be able to transform these result indicator into something that is where they have an economic engine. Say, well, show me the money question. You need to be able to respond to that. And then finally, and this goes into the timing issue, the fragmentation issue, and the uncertainty issue, is that you can put forward all these things. You can have a good theory of change. You can have all the data available. You can show that you're creating a lot of value. But if you cannot capture the value, you will find it very, very hard to mobilize a willingness to pay. And that's where you often end up. You have all these good ideas, but if you cannot mobilize a willingness to pay, then you have nothing except good intentions. And that won't really help you. So how did we solve this problem in Aarhus? So what we did here was to look at the effect chain that had 4 elements. So first of all, what we did was to take a number of people living with type 2 diabetes and offering them a very intensive intervention where we try to promote healthy eating patterns, physical exercise, a lot of different things that have a proven effect on BMI and your long-term blood sugar, long-term blood glucose level. Say, well, we do all this to the participants, and then we monitor after 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months what happens to this, how the blood sugar level of these individuals develop. So that is like the key result indicator that we look at. And then based on these two, based on this changing in long-term blood sugar, we looked at, say, okay, there's a lot of statistical models, and Amy, you probably know about them as well, but you can calculate what is the likelihood of ending up with a major kidney failure or an amputation or a lot of these different diabetes-related complications. How is the risk of developing these complications affected by a change in long-term blood sugar level? So what we did there was to use these statistical models that are approved and used by health authorities all over the world to transform a long-term blood sugar level into something that is measurable turn into an economic engine, because there's not a price to long-term blood sugar, but there is a price to managing a kidney failure. So the cost of managing a kidney failure is very clear, and it's very expensive. So by having this using these models, we could make a long-term blood glucose into an impact currency. Say, well, if you can just prove that we have changed longer-term blood sugar level, then we have proven that you will be able to reap a benefit, not today, not tomorrow, but in 5-10 years from now, you'll be able to reap this benefit. And then finally, say, based on this information, then the municipalities say, okay, now we understand the impact chain here. So you deliver intervention, we observe a change in blood sugar level. If we do observe this change, then we will be willing to pay for this change in long-term blood sugar level, because we know that it has a very well-defined impact on the risk of developing diabetes-related complications, and hence the need for services that we are to provide from the municipality. So in this way, it made a lot of sense here. So we had this distribution of risk and between the different players. So we invited investors to take the risk that you can deliver intervention that can change the long-term blood sugar level. That was their risk. So they go and finance intervention. If there is a change in long-term blood sugar, then they'll get their money back. If there's no change, they will not get their money back. And then on the other hand, you had the municipality say, if there is this change, we will pay for it. And then we will have a structure inside our municipality that will enable us to reap the benefits in 1, 5, 10 years from now. So that was how it was constructed, and it made sense to all the parties involved, and was very successful in terms of actually changing the lifestyles of the patients who got this program offered. So key learnings here is something that is very complex, the business case of prevention. We can actually make prevention investable, and you can create a new impact currencies that would enable, that will bridge the gap between problem owners, investors, and service providers. So that's one key thing here. But the two other learnings from the projects are actually more important when you look at the programs. The first thing is that the mindset matters more than contracts, and the mindset are changing. And the key thing here is that when we launched the program, we invited a lot of different stakeholders into the room. And this way of looking at health, not as an expense, but as an investment, it kind of changed the attitude and the way that I talk about health within the municipality. So just having the program like this unlocked a new way of thinking that also led to the establishment of a big health fund within the municipality. So the first program, I think it was around 1 million euros. And based on the experience from this program, they launched an internal investment fund within the municipality with an endowment of 15 million euros. So that kind of thing showed that just proving that you can make prevention investable also drove a much bigger change. And the second thing was, the third thing here was that the partnership matters more than projects. And the key thing here is, if you sit around the table and you develop an impact bond, then you need to agree on the theory of change. You need to talk about the data, the economic engine, all that. And when you have been through a process like this, then you have a much better understanding of what is at stake and how you can work together. And that means that they have fostered a number of new interesting partnerships within the municipality based on this program. So just to wrap up, I think that you had just reworded some of your conclusion, Amy, here. So the thing is that the lever exists in terms of prevention, and the evidence is maturing. So we know that it pays off to invest in prevention, but we need to unlock a willingness to pay. That is the key thing here. And the key learning here is that it might be hard to create value, but capturing value, that's the key thing here. I think that if you sit around a table, everyone could agree that a prevention program like offering healthy food to people would create a lot of value. But if you cannot capture it, then you have a problem. And I don't want to go too much into detail of how you can look at healthy food as whether it is a good case for an impact bond, the different perspectives of that. Maybe we can go into that in a Q&A session, but I can just say one thing, and is that healthy food played a vital role in the way that we managed to create a reduction in long-term blood sugar in Aarhus. And in that way, it is already part of an impact bond program. So the healthy food component is quite solid, and I'm pretty sure that you can create an impact bond with that purpose. Whether you can create an impact bond that also focus on the sustainable production of the food, it's a bit more tricky. But maybe you can go into that in a Q&A session. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hans. That was very short and in-depth, I would say. I have seen your presentations before, and I think it's always very nice to hear the story of Denmark and specifically Aarhus. And also a bit jealous because it seems that your healthcare system and the municipality are a bit more connected. So the outcome payer is maybe more like one party. So I think in our case, the challenge is very much based on the fact that obviously we have the healthcare insurance and the laws that they need to obey to, and the municipalities that are also in charge of some sort of prevention. So we have discussions with multiple stakeholders. And I was wondering, how did you tackle with so many stakeholders, or how many stakeholders were involved in your process?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that if you look at the prevention, the business case for prevention, it's a bit special. As you say, well, it's very easy in Denmark. You said it's not that easy, because if you look at the prevention and treatment of diseases, then the responsibility of prevention lies within the municipality, but the prevention for treatment lies within the regions in Denmark. And then if you become really ill and you need to have a home care, then the responsibility goes back to the municipality again. So that makes it a bit tricky. But the key thing here is that if you look at the business case, then it is so good that you as a municipality can just ignore that there will be a lot of other players who will actually benefit from what you are investing in. The business case, just looking at the business case through the lens of the municipality, is sufficiently strong that they can actually drive the whole process here. So what the municipality did was that say, well, now we will finance the outcome. We will pay for the outcome here in this program. But what we will do is we will monitor and evaluate and track the impact that we are creating for all the players around the system. Because then when we have proven that we can actually do it, then we'll go back to the government and say, hey, we have proven this works. So now you should actually help us support this at a much bigger scale. Because if we are only able to reap 50% of the benefits, then it's only fair that we should pay 50% of the value. And the reason why I said that was because I was also involved in another program in Aarhus of homeless youth, and they did exactly the same there. They were only able to reap 50% of the benefit. They monitored, and then the legislation was actually changed afterwards. So just taking the initiative there created a change in the legislation that meant that, well, now the business case is much stronger for the municipalities. So it pays off.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think what makes the business case in Aarhus strong, because I feel like that when we calculate the reduction, for example, in medication, or the cost saving when reduction of weight, we find the biggest saving is in quality of life, which is a very hard part of the impact bond to sell. So I was wondering how that is for you guys. Yeah,
so quality of life, it's actually worth nothing. And of course, this sounds strange, but I think in terms of unlocking a willingness to pay, that's really difficult. We actually just launched a new impact bond a few months ago, where we actually managed to mobilize a willingness to pay for improvement in life. But in Aarhus, there was no willingness to pay for that at all. They would only wanted to pay for reduction in long-term blood sugar, because there was the only parameter that could go into the statistical model and provide the municipality with certainty that they will reap a benefit. And the key thing here, if you look at the benefits here, there will be cost saving in terms of medicine, the treatment, all that. But to the municipality, that's again not important. There's only one thing that drives the business model here. It is that home care. If you get really sick, then you'll have a need of home care, and home care is really expensive. So the key thing here is that a lot of different economic engines, but if you want to create an impact model, you need to simplify the business case a bit. And what are the key engine here that unlocks a payment? And if the benefits are just distributed within different departments in the municipality, then you have a problem. You need to have like one of two very important wheels that can turn on the economic engine, then you should focus on them. And then the rest, it's just positive side effects.
Yeah, I think that's also what we experience with the agri-health development, that if we want to look also on the impact that you make on a farm level on the agri side, then things become very complicated, and then you have so many players, and it's more like a financing or the improvement of an area, then that you're very much talking about a target audience. So yeah, I think we can very much relate to that. And I was wondering, so you were saying that you see quite some other projects unfolding, or that you have this investment fund. Like, what do you see? How do you see the future for these kind of prevention financing, or the direction that is going to?
Yeah, so if you look at Denmark, when we started this up in Denmark, I think it was maybe 8 years ago or something like that. People were quite reluctant to engage in these models. And say, well, this is something that they do in the UK, on the US. That's not something for us Danes, because we have a strong welfare state, and let's stick to what we know. But now I think that by far Denmark is the leading country in the world when it comes to outcome contracting. I think we have at least plus 50 programs running, and a new government just came into place 2 weeks ago. And then now in their program, it is stated explicitly that they want to work with these kind of models. They have creating a national fund to accelerate the maturement of these models. And now, when this is where it becomes very interesting, is that you have now you're now trying to develop the first outcome fund here in Denmark, where you say, well, we know that if you look at the benefit that's distributed among across a lot of different sectors and players. So what would happen if we as a state go in here and establish an outcome fund? So we will pay for the outcome, or part of the outcome. So it will not be the problem up to the municipalities or the regions, but we know that that the business case at the societal level is so good that we should just accelerate the use of these models. So let's go in and substitute the models by creating a national outcome fund. It's still at a very low level, but I think this is the movement that we are seeing, and a lot of players within the space are arguing for that being the best way forward.
Interesting. And what do you see as within the movement of the impact investors? Like, are they also very much hooked on, and how much sort of like, what is sort of like the percentage of like return on investment that they would like to see? Yeah, so the problem is not a lack of investors, certainly not. I think that the problem is a lack of investable programs, and I think that there's still a cultural change that need to take place in terms of whether you have service providers who are able to come up with the right level of data, provide a solid theory of change, and then mobilizing the outcome funders in terms of municipalities, the region, to pay up for this. What we just did here in Denmark also is that we have just initiated some dialogues with the insurance companies, because they're obviously also part of this system. So what we are trying to do now is see whether we can get them into to the game here, and see if we can work with them on some of these issues. And what I sense here is general interest, but also, of course, some reluctance. It's a structural change that needs to take place. So I've heard that you should tell a story 100 times before 10% believe it, and I think we have just passed 50 maybe. So there are a lot of stories to be told in order for to mobilize the right kind of momentum here. Interesting. And in terms of like the agricultural side, do you see some sort of like movement into the regeneration of the land? Or obviously Denmark is also very much more into like the connection between nature and agriculture, and some special rules that will come up with. So do you see some potential on the agricultural side for outcome payment? There's a number of interesting. I think that you need to distinguish between the business case for agriculture and the business case for healthy food. I think these are quite different. And but within if you look at the natural conservation or all this, the nature agenda, I think that there are different programs that are being developed also by some of my colleagues, where you see, can you put a price? Can you make biodiversity into an impact currency, just as you had on CO2? Then could you do the same thing with biodiversity, create an index for biodiversity, and then use that as a metric to unlock investment opportunities? So that's an interesting trend. Of course, they're facing some problems, because it is like biodiversity. It's not really. It's a bit more complex than CO2 measurement, of course. So that's one thing. And then in terms of healthy food, you're seeing a lot of things. There are a lot of programs where healthy food
it's part of the solution. So what is needed now is to see, can you create a solid business case for healthy food or not? And I think that it not to complicate it too much, but I think that if you look at it through from the viewpoint of an economist or a financial engineer or whatever, then there's a difference between like what you eat and how you eat. And if you, from an economic perspective, it might be even more important how you eat than what you eat in terms of, for instance, dealing with loneliness and all these other issues. So that's why I wrote on my last slide that sometimes you need to look beyond the health system when you are to create a solid business case. Maybe if you want to offer a healthy food for children in schools, then it's not about reducing the risk of diabetes. It's about increasing the likelihood that they will actually get an education because they can keep their concentration level higher at a higher level. That has a much higher value than preventing diabetes, because the impact in terms of reducing the risk of diabetes will emerge 10, 15 years from now. And what happens 10 to 15 years out in space, it's really, really difficult. It's another budget and really hard to mobilize resources for that. But mobilizing resources for something that would increase completion rates in schools, that's worth a lot. And if you can, sometimes you just need to look at the problem in a different way. As in, maybe it's better to treat health as a nice side effect than the key objective, if your key objective is to promote health. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it's just you need to challenge your perception of how the business case looked like, because at the end, if you cannot mobilize a willingness to pay, then you won't get it that far.
No.
Yeah, super interesting. I have just a few questions to Amy before we'll ask some of the questions that are also in Q&A. So Amy, you said that like you see, impact investors as the role to unlock the data, because as you said, like if we cannot have a baseline and if we cannot measure something, we can also not progress from the moment where we are, because we don't know where we are right now. So, and you share with Audacious as an example of a company that creates the baseline of nutritional quality of the food. I was also wondering of your other companies which create baselines on the farming level or other levels, if maybe you can share the examples, because I think Audacious is a very good example
of course. So I think it's down to sort of mapping this causal chain that I talked about, from soil to plant and animal, and then plant and animal onto human. Because I think, as Hans has alluded to, unless you can actually validate what's happening, no one's really going to pay for it. And that requires really, really extensive data. So the two other companies that were on the slide is a company called HarvesCare, and they're using mycorrhizal fungi to improve or optimize the kind of natural soil biology. One of the things we talk about at TFT is that nature has been doing this research and development for us for 4.5 billion years, and we're not trying to do it better. We're trying to get back to that using the technology that the 21st century has provided. So in some ways, it's a bit of an odd pairing, because we're talking about old science that doesn't really require any technology and coupling it with technology. But with the mycorrhizal fungi, there's a couple of things that are happening. One is that it's reducing phosphate and nitrogen runoff into drinking water, but agricultural land. And actually, to Hans's point, one of the things that we have noticed is it's much easier to gather data on reducing toxicity than it is to prove that a nutrient uplift may or may not provide something in the future. Whereas we can categorically say that there are diseases associated with pesticide exposure. Therefore, if we reduce that by 10%, that's much, much easier kind of maths and statistics to do. And then the other company is a company called Antler Bio, and they also raise an interesting point, because they are using epigenetics to look at what inputs alter the function and the physiology of a dairy cow. And what they have seen, unsurprisingly, is that well looked after happy cows produce not only more milk, but milk with a better nutrient profile. But this kind of ties to my issue with the supply chain, because all of that milk ends up getting mixed with lots of other milk that is not Antler Bio. And so how do you actually get somebody to pay for the quality? But I think that this is kind of where I talk about raising the floor of the food system, because any of these companies are generating transparency. At the moment, we have no idea what's in any of the milk. So it's a starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's why we need this baseline measurement, right? And I think it's also interesting that you probably are familiar with the Bionutrient Food Alliance from US, which is saying that FDA is like measuring 150 maybe at max compounds in food, and then we have around 25,000 compounds in food that we could be measuring. And the question is, which is associated with health, which is associated with toxicity, at what size? All of this is super interesting and probably very long timeline for us to define all of this. And so I know that we have some doctors in the audience, and I'm also wondering for you to transition to, as you said, maybe there is quite a lot of doctors in the impact investing, but maybe not that many doctors in agriculture. For doctors which would like to or are thinking about transitioning to the space, what do you recommend as a starting point for or general doctors, but also healthcare professionals to enter the agri-health space?
Well, I went to Groundswell. That was my first ever exposure. Well, actually, that's not true. I read Ultra Processed People, which is actually brilliant at touching on some of the ag stuff. But then I went to Groundswell. I think you can only really follow your passion because it's pretty early what we're really talking about. And if you haven't got thick skin and a patient mind, then it is hard to stick with it. But I think that what clinicians can bring, or any healthcare professionals can bring to the table, is an experience that actually no one really has in prevention at the moment. You know, we've seen what happens when you take lifestyle related disease to as far downstream as it goes. And I think that knowledge is really helpful. How we assess, how we stratify, all of those things actually become really valuable in the work that I do on a daily basis, because we're talking about evidence and how we use evidence to drive capital into something that is not proven, but definitely plausible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. So,
well, follow your passion goes to Groundswell.
Yeah, really,
I think
exactly.
those two are very good entries.
Yeah, definitely go to Groundswell.
Because we'll be there too, and then
exactly.
hang out with us and chat about nutrient density and soil health.
Absolutely.
Also good. Okay, dogs. So we have 8 minutes left, and we have 2 questions. So I'm gonna get going with some of those questions. So I'll just take the final one here. Andy asked a question about impact bonds. So, what are the usual duration of the impact bonds, and are there investment appetite barriers to capturing versus long-term value?
Yeah. So I think this goes for me. So I think that the most impact bonds that we have seen in Denmark, they have a time horizon around 3 years. So what you want to do here is that you want to balance it. So the service provider and the investor, they'll usually prefer the time horizon to be as short as possible, because having capital out there, it's costly for them. And then the problem owners will typically prefer to have a measurement, say 5-10 years out in time, and then the compromise usually end up at the 3 to 5 years. But you have examples in Finland where you have an impact bond with a duration of 16 years and 50 service provider. I think it's like a huge program where you want to work with a group over a very long time horizon, bring in the different players when they're needed, etc. 3 to 5 years. That's typical. And the second question was, what was that, Susanna?
Yeah, it was if you think that it's possible to mobilize employers' willingness to pay with increase in engagement/productivity and decrease in turnover, I suspect fractional versus health benefit, but another source of value.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I think that if you look at the business case for healthy food and physical exercise and all kind of good like healthy life behaviors, then sick leave is the most relevant parameter to look at. So whether you're sick from work or absent from work or not, that unlocks a very, very tangible economic engine that everyone can understand. So we have municipalities in Denmark who are willing to pay for intervention that can just reduce the number of days that people are absent from work. So that's also the most popular program that the investment program that are launched in Finland. So that's definitely a key thing here. And we have different programs where we have been looking into that in Denmark. And also from a municipality and region perspective, it's really relevant to look at this parameter. So definitely important. You also have employers who have been paying for the same thing, not in terms of healthy food or physical exercise, but for stress reduction. So you have stress reduction programs where you also have employers that are engaging as problem owners here and paying for stress programs that are effectively reduce the number of days that you're absent from work.
Yeah, thank you for that. Amy, I saw there was a question before from Dina, which was asking how patients can also become like the advocates of a microbiome health. I'm wondering of like soil microbiome. I'm wondering if you see any increase of the awareness among patients and consumers of the connection between gut microbiome to human microbiome.
Definitely consumers, not so much on patients, although I think that even in the last year since I left clinical medicine, there will be a huge shift. I think it's something crazy like 40 million people a day are using AI for health related questions. So I'm sure some of this will start to come to the fore. I mean, the patients that I saw were not really in a position to be asking. It was too late for them to be asking those questions, but definitely the consumers are. There's so much consumer awareness and consumer products focused on the gut microbiome. I think if you look at the kind of Google Analytics, it's like one of the most searched things over the past few years. You know, there are companies like Zoe, and so there's definitely a lot of stuff happening. I still see a real lack of awareness that you are not what you eat, you are what you eat has eaten. Very few people who are actually eating. I suppose organic is a good example of this. You know, it was in some ways a great success, but it still makes a tiny portion of purchased food, and whether that's cost or not, I don't know. But I still don't think there's that higher level awareness that how your food is grown can actually contribute to gut microbiome disruption. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, totally. So great to hear that the consumer's awakening so sad to know that
Definitely.
For many patients it's already too late when they're kind of maybe. And
I think the risk with the consumer knowledge is that it just continues to separate those who have from those who have not. That's always going to be the risk. But there is also that cost curve argument that I mentioned earlier, which is, you know, historically we have accepted that people with more money will buy things and it will drive down the cost. And that's just how, well, Hans knows the economics better than I do, but that's how just some of it has to work. And if we can have a kind of top down and a bottom up approach from a public sector perspective, then I think it makes it a little bit more democratic.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I think I will take one final question this time to Hans. Dina was wondering if you can compare the cost of maintenance of diabetic patients to healthcare providers in different systems, for example, in the US, UK, and Canada. She's wondering about the cost benefits analysis in unique contexts. And that's also very much relates to a question that I had in my head, because you said that there are statistical like modeling which you can plug in your results of your reduction of HbA1c, and then can kind of give you an argument of how much money can you save over a long time by reducing the care home delivery or amputation, etc. Like, where are those models? Where can we find them? Because we didn't hear about them. And yeah, how context specific are there?
Yeah, so the number of different models out there. So it's a quite complex question. So the number of different questions that are included in this question. But I think that if you look at the key change, key effect change here, so like a change in blood sugar level, what would that imply in terms of the risk of developing certain diseases? That is, I would not say universal, because there are some differences, because you will have access to different kind of support system in different countries, but that kind of the equation is quite general. There will be different things you need to look into, because ethnicity, for instance, might have an impact on the likelihood of developing certain diseases, etc. But that part of the effect chain is pretty well established, and you can it's publicly available. The same goes if you look at there have been number of cost studies where you can look at you looked at what are the costs of having diabetes without any complications, with minor complications, and with major complications. There's a study from the Netherlands as well. There's a study from Denmark. And I think that The levels might differ a bit from country to country, depending on what kind of system you have. But the magnitude between the cost of having diabetes with or without complications is pretty much the same, I would assume. Or at least I would assume that if you are to create an impact bond, then you'll get a good head start by looking at these differences and say, well, you can see from data from Denmark and Holland that this is this difference in magnitude of cost. So it might be similar in our country. So I think you can get a good head start there. If you look at what kind of cost, if you are to create an impact bond and you need to mobilize outcome funding, then I think as we did with the municipality, you need to look and have a closer look at under the hood of the economic engine. And the thing, if you look at the municipality and you look at diabetes prevention, it's all about whether you can avoid home care or not. That's the major component here. If you look at it from an insurance perspective in Denmark, the key thing here is whether you lose your ability to work or not. That's the only thing that matters, because all health, all treatment, it's free in Denmark. So the only thing that matters is that if you lose your ability to work. So from that perspective, when you are to look at a business case here, you need to look at the local context and see what kind of arguments, economic arguments, make people tick in your specific context. And that will differ from country to country. I hope that was not a too vague a question, but it is very context specific.
Yeah, no, and it is the same in our, I think in our case, and it's also a lot in, I think, who do you have at the table? They also have a different outcomes that they're interested. So yeah, it's super valuable. Well, okay, we are done with our today's webinar and the webinar series. So Hans and Amy, thank you so much for finishing up this really cool 5 months of learning. And I think that was really cool to learn so much. And I think we'll continue with the series. Maybe if we focus on food medicine, maybe we'll focus on farming. We don't know yet, but we'll make sure that we'll let you know. And yeah, just thank you again, and continue your amazing work in both the financial and agri-health side, because thanks to people like you, we can learn and we can bring this knowledge to other people. And that's so valuable as a part of our mission to disseminate, like, what is agri-health? How can we do it in a really tangible way? Not just talking about it, but actually doing it. That's the most important. So
thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure. And thank you, Amy.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
you.
And have a lovely afternoon.